This presentation is on Gregor Mendel and his laws of inheritance. Everything we know about genetics came from Gregor Mendel. This is a picture of Gregor Mendel. He was a monk who lived in Austria and did the first experiments with genetics. He formed the laws of heredity. We're going to start with talking about why Mendel succeeded, why he was successful. But first, Gregor Mendel, as I said, was the father of genetics. Everything we know began with him. He did the first studies of heredity, so he ran the first experiments, and heredity is the passing of characteristics from parents to offspring. Genetics is the study of heredity. And the characteristics that get passed from parents to offspring are called traits. Let's go over a few more words, vocabulary terms that you will need to know throughout this unit. Traits. These are specific characteristics that vary or are different from one individual to another. So you have traits. If you have siblings, they have traits. You might share some of those traits, but not all of them. Your traits came from your parents. Hybrid. This is the offspring of crosses between parents with different characteristics. A cross is when the sperm and egg from two parents create a zygote, and the zygote, as we learned when we reviewed meiosis, gets chromosomes from each of the parents. The chromosomes carry those characteristics. Genes. These are portions or segments of DNA that determine the traits. Alleles. Alleles are different forms of the same gene. You could have a gene for hair color, or many genes for hair color for that matter, but you could have a gene for hair color, and you could have one gene for blonde hair and one gene for brown hair. So those two colors are different forms of the same gene. Mendel was successful first because he chose his subject carefully. He used garden peas for his study. Pea plants have male and female gametes, or male and female sex cells. They also have male and female on the same flower, which makes it really easy to do genetic studies with them. This allowed Mendel to control the fertilization process. And you'll see when you do one of the DNA from the beginning assignments how he actually did that. Garden peas also have only a few traits to keep track of. So Mendel took these pea plants and he crossed them, or he bred one parent plant with another parent plant. Fertilization is the uniting of male and female gametes. Normally this happens naturally, meaning the sperm or the pollen from the male plant parts crosses or gets united with the egg plant part. A cross means combining gametes from parents with different traits. For example, Mendel crossed a purple flowered plant with a white flowered plant. This is how he actually went through the process. He removed the stamens from the purple flower. The stamens carry the male parts, or the pollen. In humans, we would call it the sperm. He transferred that pollen from the stamens of the white flower to the carpel of the purple flower. The carpel has the female part, the egg in it. Number 3, he pollinated the carpel, or the pollinated carpel matured into a pea pod. And then each pea could produce a new plant. He planted the seeds from the pod, and then he examined or looked at all the offspring. And he saw that when he crossed a purple flower with a white flower, all of the first generation offspring had purple flowers. The second reason Mendel was successful was because he was a very careful researcher. He used very carefully controlled experiments. He only studied one trait at a time. He kept very detailed notes on his data. And before we go any further, it's important that you know a few more terms. Phenotype. This is the way an organism looks and behaves. Its physical characteristics. For example, tall, green, brown hair, blue eyes. It also covers the way your body behaves. The fact that you have 2 arms. The fact that the way your stomach digests your food. The way that your heart pumps. Those are all part of your phenotype. So in order to remember phenotype, think phenotype, physical appearance. The genotype, on the other hand, this is the actual gene combination that you have. Sometimes referred to the allelic combination of an organism. We represent the genotype using capital and lowercase letters, like this. You'll see how that goes a little later. There are 2 possible genotypes that organisms that follow these rules could have. They could have a homozygous genotype. This means that the 2 alleles that they inherited from their parents are the same. And back to how we represent that, we would write that as capital T, or lowercase t. They could also be heterozygous. This means that the 2 alleles that they inherited were different, one big and one little. Let's talk about Mendel's monohybrid crosses. If you remember back from the very beginning of the school year, we talked about the prefix mono, meaning would. And we talked about hybrid, meaning the offspring from parents with different traits. So we're talking about 1 trait here. Mendel studied 7 traits on those garden pea plants very carefully, but he only studied them one at a time. He crossed plants with different traits to see what traits the offspring would end up with. Those offspring were called hybrids, and again, that means offspring of parents with different traits. A monohybrid cross is one that looks at only 1 trait. For example, we're going to look at plant height. Garden pea plants can either be tall or short. Mendel noted that the size of the pea plants varied. He crossbred these pea plants to find some surprising results. We'll start by looking at tall plants compared to dwarf plants, or short. In the first generation, Mendel crossed 2 plants, 1 tall and 1 short. They had come from tall populations and short populations, so all of the pea plants in the tall population were tall, and all of the pea plants in the short population were short. These plants are called the parent generation, or what we'll call the pea generation. The offspring are all called the first filial generation, or the F1 generation. So think of these as the kids. In this cross, with 1 tall and 1 short, all the offspring were tall. The short plants were totally excluded. So this is what it looked like. Mendel's cross between tall pea plants yielded all tall pea plants. His cross between, let me show that first. So 2 tall plants, the X here represents the cross, all yielded, or all the offspring were tall. When he crossed 2 dwarf pea plants, all the offspring were dwarf. These are the 2 pea parent generation plants he used in order to figure out what would happen in the F1 generation. So he took this plant and crossed it with this plant. Mendel's cross between tall pea plants and small pea plants yielded all tall pea plants. That's fairly interesting because one might wonder, well, what happened to this short gene? Then he did another cross. He crossed 2 plants from the F1 generation. So remember, those were all tall. So in phenotype, all of the 2 plants that he crossed looked tall. The offspring from that cross are called the second filial generation, or the F2 generation. Think of these as the grandchildren. Mendel found that 3/4 of the offspring were tall and 1/4 were short. The short plants reappeared from the grandparent plants. And this is what it looked like. He took 2 F1 tall pea plants and he got 3/4 of the plants were tall and 1/4 of them were small. That does not mean that he only got 4 offspring plants. He could have had 100 offspring plants. It just means that the ratio was 1 out of 4. We could also look at another trait that Mendel studied, like flower color. In this, the P generation, we call these true breeding because that means everything from that generation produces purple flowers. Or, on the other side, everything from this generation produces white flowers. You take 1 purple and 1 white, you cross those 2, you get the F1 generation. These are hybrids. All the plants here show a flower that is purple, and that, again, is their phenotype. However, when you take 2 of these plants and cross them, for the F2 generation, you get a ratio of 3 purple to 1 white. And this was his actual data. 705 plants had purple flowers, while 224 plants had white flowers. If you simplify that fraction, you see that it comes out as 3 to 1. To go any further, we have to understand alleles, dominance, and segregation. Just as a reminder, a gene is a section or a segment of DNA that codes for 1 protein. The proteins are responsible for the height of the plant and the color of the flower. These genes control and produce traits. The genes Mendel studied came in 2 forms, tall versus short, round versus wrinkled when he studied the shape of the pea itself, yellow peas versus green peas, etc. Those alternate forms of a gene are called alleles. So the round and wrinkled, those are the alleles for pea shape. Tall and short, those are the alleles for plant height. Yellow and green, those are the alleles for pod color. Alleles are represented by a 1 or 2 letter symbol. For example, capital T for tall, lowercase t for short. Here's what the chromosomes that these genes are actually found on look like. This is the chromosome from one parent, this is the chromosome from another parent. You notice that they have the same gene in the same location for flower color. It's called the locus, it means location, for flower color. One of the chromosomes had an allele for purple flowers, while the other one had an allele for white flowers. Remember that these 2 chromosomes are called homologous pairs because they match each other, both in size and in pattern. These 2 alleles are now known to be found on homologous chromosomes, or a matching pair, one from each parent. So let's talk about the law of dominance. This is one of the laws that Mendel wrote after he studied the pea plants. First, he said that a dominant trait is the trait that will always be expressed if at least 1 dominant allele is present. We represent dominant alleles with capital letters. A recessive trait will only be expressed if both alleles, one from each parent, are recessive. Recessive traits are represented by a lowercase letter. By convention, meaning out of popularity, when choosing what letter you would use to represent alleles, usually the dominant trait is given, the dominant trait is always given a capital letter. The lowercase of that same letter is the recessive trait. You don't mix letters. You pick one letter and you stick to it. Also, some letters are better than others. For example, think about writing a capital S. It looks a lot like a lowercase s. So, usually scientists will pick a letter that has a more distinctive difference between capital and lowercase. For example, it's okay to say that short hair is the dominant form and it's big S. Short hair would also be big S, little s, and long hair is little s. However, it's better to use H for hair because you can see the difference between capital and lowercases better. So if we use tall and short pea plants for an example when we're talking about dominance, which of these will show the dominant and recessive trait? We have big T, big T, big T, little t, and little t, little t. What would each of them show? Would they show the dominant trait, which is tall, or would they show the recessive trait, which is short? If you guessed that these two would show the dominant trait, you're correct. This one shows the recessive trait. The law of dominance says that if there is a capital letter present, that will show the dominant trait. Only when there are two recessive alleles present in the offspring will the recessive trait be shown. So let's practice picking letters. The following traits are found in the common Shirtus americanus. Polka dots are dominant to stripes. If I were choosing this, I would probably choose the letter P for polka dots. Capital P would show the dominant trait, which in this case is polka dots. Lowercase p would show the recessive trait, which would be stripes. Let's do another. Long sleeves are dominant to short sleeves. Well, if long sleeves is the dominant trait, I would use capital L for long sleeves and lowercase l for short sleeves. On your assignment, it asks you to write down these two, and I want you to do the next three on your own. Collared shirts are recessive. Think about what the opposite of that would be. The opposite would be the dominant trait. Choose a letter, and like the examples up here, tell me what it would look like. In the next one, buttons are dominant over snaps. And on the last one, pockets are recessive. Another thing to think about is the phenotype that would be shown. In the last slide, we saw you were giving me the alleles for the genotype. In this slide, I want you to tell me the phenotype, or what the organism would look like. When an organism is studied for 3 different genes and has the alleles big A, big B, little b, big C, it's homozygous for the A and C genes, but heterozygous for the B gene. If A stands for antenna or no antenna, B stands for black versus purple, and C stands for chompers versus no chompers, what would this organism look like? Would it have an antenna? Would it be black or purple? And would it have chompers or no chompers? Make sure that answer is included in your assignment. Now let's move on to the law of segregation. Mendel asked himself, how did the recessive short plants reappear in the F2 generation? He concluded that each tall plant from the F1 generation carried 2 alleles, one dominant and one recessive. So all of those plants were big T, little t. He also concluded that only one allele from each parent went to each offspring. His correct hypothesis was that somehow during fertilization, the alleles separated or segregated and combined with another allele from the other parent. The law of segregation states that during gamete formation, the alleles separate to different gametes. So here's this in plain English. You've got genetic information from mom, genetic information from dad. When those sperm and egg are coming together, it could be the sperm could have the dominant allele or the recessive allele in order to give to the offspring. The egg could have the dominant allele or the recessive allele to give to the offspring. And those combine in random ways. For example, if father is big T, little t, and mother is big T, little t in the F1 generation, then in the F2 generation, the father could give a big T and the mother could give a big T to the offspring, or the father could give a big T and the mom could give a little t to the offspring, or both parents could give the recessive allele, the little t, to the offspring. In this case, if mom looks like this, if mom has these genes and dad has these genes, the kid could have any of these 3 combination of genes. So the law of dominance explained the heredity of the offspring that mom and dad got, but the law of segregation explains the heredity that this generation gets. So to review, in the parent generation, the purple flowers, and remember the color would be the phenotype, were big P, and the white flowers were little p. In this case, the P's represent the genotype. The gametes, this gamete could only get a big P, and this gamete, or sex cell, sperm and egg, could only get a little p. Those combined to give the F1 generation purple flowers with one big P and one little p. The law of dominance explains what I just talked about. The law of segregation explains the next step. If you combine a big P, little p flower with another big P, little p flower, you could get 3 purple flowers and 1 white flower. The law of segregation says that the parents could give either big P or little p to the offspring. If you have any questions on this assignment, please don't hesitate to ask. I know that some of this is confusing, so please make sure you message your questions to me.